Elon Musk marries judge to escape court case. What happens next is shocking. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom groaned as they opened, drawing the attention of everyone inside. Heads turned in unison, and the room fell silent for a beat as Elon Musk entered. The air shifted. Something about him changed the mood of the room. Dressed in a sharp black suit, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who didn't just belong anywhere. He owned every space he stepped into. Yet today, he wasn't his usual charismatic self. His brow was furrowed, his expression stern, and his gaze locked immediately on the judge's bench at the far end of the room. Judge Lawrence Hensley sat there, an imposing figure with his silver hair and piercing eyes. Yet something about him was off. His face looked pale, his shoulders stiff, and his knuckles white as they gripped the wooden arms of his chair. His reputation preceded him. A man of honor, integrity, and justice. But today, a shadow seemed to hang over him. Even his voice, when he cleared his throat to begin, trembled slightly, though he quickly masked it. "Order in the court," he said, banging the gavel, but the usual authority wasn't there. Elon noticed it instantly. Elon slid into the back row of the gallery, the murmurs starting immediately as people whispered to one another. "Why's Elon Musk here?" one man muttered. "Is he involved in this case?" "No way," someone whispered back. "What's a billionaire doing in a small courtroom like this?" The case at hand was seemingly unremarkable on paper. A land dispute between a real estate giant and a small community group fighting to keep their public spaces intact. Yet, as the arguments began, the tension in the air grew sharper. The real estate lawyer, a slick man with slicker hair, rose first. His voice boomed through the chamber, calm and dripping with confidence. "Your Honor, the law is very clear on this matter. My clients have followed all proper procedures, met every legal requirement, and are well within their rights to proceed with this development. This frivolous delay is costing my clients time and money." The lawyer didn't even glance at the gallery, but Musk's sharp eyes stayed trained on him. Elon's jaw tightened as he studied the man, then glanced toward Judge Hensley. The judge's expression was strained, and when the community group's lawyer, a young woman with dark, determined eyes, stood to speak, the contrast was almost jarring. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but carrying the faint tremble of nerves. "This case isn't just about paperwork. It's about people, real people, whose lives will be impacted. My clients represent a community that depends on this park, on these public spaces, for their families, their health, and their well-being. If we lose this space to corporate greed, we lose more than just land." Before she could continue, the real estate lawyer snorted audibly, cutting her off. "Your Honor, we don't have time for speeches. The facts are plain." The judge looked up sharply, a flicker of irritation in his eyes, but he hesitated. He paused as if searching for words, and the courtroom felt it. A subtle wavering, a crack in his usual unshakable demeanor. Elon noticed it, his focus narrowing like a hawk's. Something was wrong. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees as he listened. The young lawyer faltered slightly before pressing on. "The community has filed multiple objections, Your Honor, and we believe there are significant irregularities in..." Her words were drowned out by a sudden, deliberate shuffling in the corner of the room. Elon's eyes flicked toward the disturbance, where a man in a dark suit sat, arms crossed and sunglasses perched atop his nose despite being indoors. He shifted, the faint smirk on his face unmistakable. Musk clocked him immediately. He'd seen men like this before. Quiet, confident, and dangerous. Men who didn't need to speak to issue threats. Judge Hensley's gavel hit the bench. "Recess. 10 minutes," he announced abruptly, standing from his chair. His robe swayed as he left the bench without explanation, leaving the room in stunned silence. The gallery erupted into murmurs again as the judge vanished through a side door. People exchanged confused glances. "What was that?" someone asked. "Why would he just stop like that?" Elon stood, his gaze still fixed on the man in the dark suit. The real estate lawyer was already smiling smugly, whispering something to his associate, and the young community lawyer looked stunned and deflated. She glanced down at her notes, biting her lip as if she could already feel the battle slipping away. Elon moved toward the front of the gallery. His footsteps echoed across the tile floor, and for the first time, the real estate lawyer noticed him. His smug expression flickered slightly, replaced with something bordering on confusion. "Mr. Musk?" he asked, the cockiness in his voice faltering. Are you involved in this case?" Elon didn't respond. He walked past the lawyer as though he didn't exist, his focus still on the courtroom door where the judge had disappeared. The man in the dark suit noticed Elon's movements, straightening slightly and uncrossing his arms. For the first time, the man seemed curious, perhaps even cautious. Musk stopped near the young lawyer's table. She looked up at him, startled, as he leaned down slightly. "Don't stop fighting," he said quietly, his voice low enough for her ears only. Her eyes widened, confusion mixing with sudden determination. "But they're not even listening. Did you see the judge? He's not himself." Elon straightened, his expression unreadable. "There's more going on here than you think." As the courtroom settled, Judge Hensley returned, but his steps were slower, heavier. He avoided looking at the gallery, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The man in the dark suit tilted his head slightly, his smirk returning as though he had already won. Elon watched it all, his sharp mind piecing the puzzle together. He didn't have all the answers yet, but something was wrong in this courtroom, deeply wrong. And whatever it was, he wasn't leaving until he uncovered the truth. The room settled into an uneasy silence as Judge Hensley returned to the bench. He moved slowly, the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. He glanced briefly at the man in the dark suit, just for a second, but it was enough. Elon Musk saw it. He filed that look away in his mind like a critical piece of a puzzle. Court is back in session, the bailiff called, though the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating almost. The young community lawyer stood again, clearly shaken but determined to finish what she started. She glanced briefly at Musk, as if the billionaire's words had sparked some fire in her chest, and then turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steadier now, "before we recessed, I was explaining the irregularities in the real estate firm's permits. This community has followed every legal path to oppose this project. Yet those objections have been repeatedly overlooked." Judge Hensley shifted in his seat, as though her words physically unsettled him. He picked up a pen and began tapping it softly against the bench. A nervous habit, Musk noted. The man in the dark suit, sitting at the back of the courtroom, leaned forward slightly, as if silently daring the judge to speak. Before the judge could respond, the real estate lawyer rose from his seat, deliberately slow and condescending. "Your Honor, once again, we're hearing emotional appeals and baseless accusations. My clients have met every requirement. I'd like to remind the court that these irregularities are unsubstantiated and irrelevant." He turned toward the gallery, his eyes lingering on Elon Musk for just a moment before smirking slightly. "If this community had more time to research their case instead of chasing media attention, we might not even be here." The subtle jab was unmistakable, and Elon's gaze darkened. He said nothing, but his presence alone was enough to make the lawyer shift slightly, a hint of unease flickering across his features. Judge Hensley cleared his throat, avoiding Musk's gaze entirely. "Proceed with your argument," he said quietly, his voice more subdued than anyone had ever heard it. The real estate lawyer didn't waste the opportunity. He launched into a flurry of legal jargon, burying the conversation in language that only the most seasoned lawyers could follow. Terms flew through the air like darts: zoning codes, variance approvals, environmental exceptions, all designed to overwhelm and distract. The young lawyer tried to interject several times, but he spoke over her, his tone growing louder and sharper with every sentence. "You can't ignore the public impact," she finally managed to say, raising her voice just enough to cut through his monologue. "These spaces belong to the community, Your Honor. People's lives are more than just numbers on a developer's spreadsheet." The room fell silent. The real estate lawyer scoffed, but something in the gallery shifted. The spectators, who had been quiet until now, began murmuring again. Elon turned his head slightly, noticing the small crowd of residents in the back row. Elderly couples, parents clutching their children, and young teens. All of them watching this case with desperate hope in their eyes. Musk didn't miss a thing. The clenched fists, the silent prayers, the defeated slouches of those who'd already resigned themselves to loss. The real estate lawyer slammed a hand against his table. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant." Judge Hensley flinched slightly, as though the loud sound had jolted him back to reality. He hesitated, his pen stopping mid-tap. For a moment, it seemed like he might push back, like the honorable judge everyone knew was still inside him. But then his gaze drifted back to the man in the dark suit, whose expression was unreadable but powerful. A silent threat. "Objection sustained," Judge Hensley muttered finally, his voice a low growl. "Please stick to the facts of the case." The young lawyer's shoulders sagged slightly, but Musk caught the fire still burning in her eyes. She wasn't done fighting, even if the system seemed set against her. Elon leaned back in his chair, his gaze flickering between the judge and the man in the dark suit. There it was again, a moment of silent understanding passing between the two, a tension that wasn't visible to everyone else but was glaringly obvious to Musk. The pieces were starting to connect in his mind. The real estate lawyer continued his argument, but Musk's attention shifted back to the man in the suit. He was on the phone now, whispering something while keeping his eyes locked on the judge. Musk's mind raced. He didn't know exactly what leverage this man had, but it was enough to rattle a respected judge into submission. Bribery? Threats? Blackmail? It didn't matter. What mattered was that Musk now had a target. He rose silently from his seat, moving toward the back of the courtroom. His footsteps were soft, but his presence drew the attention of everyone around him. Reporters, who had been sitting quietly until now, perked up immediately, their cameras following him as he strode past. The man in the dark suit noticed Musk's approach. His jaw tightened, and he hung up the phone abruptly. The two men locked eyes for the first time, and for a moment, it was as if the room had fallen completely still. "Can I help you?" the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Elon's expression was calm, almost amused, but there was steel behind his eyes. "Just curious," he replied smoothly. "I couldn't help but notice how invested you are in this case." The man smirked. "It's none of your concern." Musk raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you." The tension between them was palpable, enough that even the reporters began whispering to each other again. Musk didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked back toward his seat, but he knew he'd rattled the man. He'd planted a seed of doubt, and that was all he needed for now. As he sat back down, the young community lawyer glanced at him, her expression a mixture of awe and curiosity. She leaned over slightly, whispering, "What did you say to him?" "Just letting him know I'm paying attention," Musk replied quietly, his gaze locked on the bench. Judge Hensley looked back down at his papers, his pen tapping faster now. The judge's discomfort was growing, and Musk could feel it. Whatever was controlling him, it was about to crack. Elon sat back in his seat, his gaze steady as the real estate lawyer continued droning on with confidence. The lawyer's tone was slick, his argument relentless, as he worked to bury the opposition under an avalanche of legal jargon and dismissive rhetoric. Across the aisle, the young lawyer gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles went white. She leaned in to scribble something down on her notes, though the weariness in her posture said it all. She was losing faith. Judge Hensley, meanwhile, sat back stiffly, as though he were carved from stone. He nodded absently at the real estate lawyer's points, his hand still absently tapping the bench with his pen. Musk studied the judge's every movement. Each tap of that pen felt deliberate now, as though it were code. And the man in the dark suit, now leaning back in his chair again, watched the judge carefully, his smirk growing wider with every passing second. Musk could see the cracks forming. Whatever power this man held over the judge was tightening its grip. The gallery was fidgeting now, the community members whispering among themselves. A woman with a toddler shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while an older man leaned forward with his hands folded in silent frustration. The tension was spreading like a virus, seeping into everyone present. Musk exhaled slowly, his instincts sharpening. This wasn't just a legal case anymore, it was theater, a show being orchestrated from behind the scenes. The pieces didn't fit together, but one thing was clear. There was corruption in the room, and Musk hated corruption. The real estate lawyer paused mid-sentence to drink water, giving everyone a moment to collect their thoughts. The break in his relentless tirade allowed the young community lawyer to gather herself. She stood up again, her voice wavering but growing stronger. "Your Honor," she said, clearing her throat and steadying her words. "The opposing counsel has spent this entire day deflecting from the real issue. This isn't about paperwork or legal loopholes. It's about justice. It's about the people, this community. You know that as well as I do." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she stared at Judge Hensley, and then her voice softened. "Your Honor, this isn't you." The room froze. Musk's eyes flicked to her, surprised by the sudden personal appeal. The judge shifted uncomfortably, his pen going still for the first time. His eyes darted toward the man in the dark suit, who didn't move but whose expression hardened ever so slightly. The unspoken tension thickened further, as though the young lawyer had unwittingly pressed on a nerve. "Your Honor," the real estate lawyer snapped suddenly, rising to his feet and shooting a glare toward his opponent. "This kind of manipulation has no place in a court of law. I ask you to strike that from the record." Judge Hensley hesitated, his lips parting to speak, but no words came. Musk watched it all play out with keen attention, his sharp mind turning. The judge's indecision told him everything. The man in the dark suit had leverage, dangerous leverage, and Judge Hensley was being forced to dance to his tune. The young lawyer's words had hit harder than anyone realized, and Musk could see the cracks widening in the judge's resolve. Then the real estate lawyer doubled down. "This community needs to face reality, Your Honor. My clients have already won in every meaningful way. This proceeding is a waste of the court's time." "Objection," the young lawyer shot back. "We have presented evidence." "And it's meaningless," the real estate lawyer spat, his temper rising for the first time. "This case is finished. Sit down," Judge Hensley barked, his voice rising unexpectedly as he slammed his gavel against the bench. The sudden outburst startled everyone, even the real estate lawyer, who quickly dropped back into his seat. The judge's hands were trembling as he gripped the gavel, his chest rising and falling. Something was boiling beneath the surface. Musk could see it, like watching a dam about to burst. The room went silent again. Even the murmurs from the gallery had died down. Judge Hensley's voice cracked as he spoke. "This court will take no further interruptions." He looked toward the young lawyer, his tone stern but lacking its usual edge. "Proceed with your closing arguments." The real estate lawyer smirked again, clearly thinking he'd won. But Elon Musk, still seated quietly, saw something else. The judge wasn't just frustrated, he was conflicted. Whatever hold the man in the dark suit had over him, it was starting to crumble. Musk leaned back in his seat, his arms folded across his chest, and he let the scene play out. His mind was racing, piecing together the next step. The young lawyer adjusted her blazer and picked up her notes, though her hands were shaking slightly. Her voice was quiet when she began. "Your Honor, I understand that the law can feel like it's on one side sometimes. I know it feels like you're following rules that don't make sense. But laws were made for people, not corporations. And I believe, no, I know you see that too." Her words hung in the air, soft but powerful. Judge Hensley didn't look up, but his pen stayed frozen in his hand, unmoving for the first time since the proceedings began. The real estate lawyer rolled his eyes dramatically, muttering something under his breath. "You're wasting your time," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The decision has already been made." Elon Musk tilted his head slightly, his calm expression masking the storm building inside him. The man in the dark suit shifted again, as though he, too, could feel the sudden change in the air. Something had shifted in the room, small but significant. Musk stood. It wasn't a dramatic movement, but it carried weight. All heads turned to him, whispers immediately erupting in the gallery. What's he doing? Is Musk involved? Even the judge looked up sharply, startled by the sudden movement. Musk didn't say anything. He simply walked, slowly and deliberately, down the aisle toward the front of the courtroom. The real estate lawyer frowned, clearly unsure of what to make of it. The young lawyer froze, her eyes widening. "Mr. Musk," Judge Hensley finally said, his voice breaking the silence. "Are you?" Elon stopped at the front of the gallery and turned toward the man in the dark suit. He looked him square in the eye, his voice steady and quiet but carrying across the room. "You've had your fun," Musk said softly, "but I'm done watching." The man in the suit stiffened, his smirk fading. The room held its breath as Musk turned to face the judge, his expression calm but unrelenting. Judge Hensley looked at him, the conflict written all over his face. In that moment, Musk didn't need to say anything more. He'd made his presence known. And whatever power had been holding this courtroom hostage, it was starting to slip. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes remained fixed on Musk as he stood there, calm and immovable, like the eye of a hurricane. The man in the dark suit didn't flinch, but his expression betrayed him. His confidence flickered for just a moment before he masked it again. The judge, still gripping his gavel, looked like a man cornered. The pen, which had been his constant companion, lay still on the bench, as if even it had lost the will to tap. "Mr. Musk," Judge Hensley said again, his voice sharper now, trying to reassert control. "This is a court of law. Your presence here is noted, but I cannot allow any disruptions." "I'm not disrupting anything, Your Honor," Elon said evenly, his voice soft but carrying enough weight to fill the room. "I'm simply listening, like everyone else." The gallery stirred, whispers erupting again. Reporters angled their cameras to catch every detail. Musk's stance, the tension in the room, the wary glances darting between the judge and the man in the dark suit. It was becoming clear to everyone that there was more to this case than a legal dispute over zoning laws. A battle far bigger was unfolding. The real estate lawyer, who had been sitting in smug satisfaction, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is absurd. With all due respect, this courtroom is being turned into a circus. Mr. Musk has no place here. Do I not?" Musk cut in, his gaze never leaving the lawyer. "As far as I can tell, this is a public courtroom. Or have the rules changed?" The lawyer hesitated, clearly thrown off by Musk's calm confidence. He opened his mouth to retort but seemed to realize there was no winning this exchange. Instead, he turned back to the judge, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Your Honor, this is a distraction. This community has no legal grounds. My clients have abided by every law." "Every law?" Musk interjected again, his tone sharp now. His voice cut through the room like a blade. "Funny. I could have sworn I heard the word irregularities mentioned earlier." The young community lawyer's head snapped toward Musk in surprise. Her eyes widened, as though suddenly realizing what he was doing. The real estate lawyer's face turned crimson. "Mr. Musk," Judge Hensley barked, his voice faltering, "I will not allow this." "Then allow the truth," Musk said smoothly, turning toward the judge with a calculated look. The words hung heavy in the air, lingering like smoke. "Because we're all here for that, aren't we?" The tension was unbearable now, a crackling energy spreading through the room. Judge Hensley's shoulders stiffened as he looked down at his notes, trying to pretend he hadn't heard Musk's words. The pen sat untouched on the bench. The man in the dark suit was no longer leaning back. He sat upright, his eyes narrowed dangerously as he stared at Musk. There was no smirk now. He seemed to recognize that Musk wasn't just posturing. He was dismantling the facade, brick by brick. The real estate lawyer, still flustered, seized on the silence to regain control. "Your Honor, I implore you to bring this farce to an end. My clients have complied with every legal requirement. This community has wasted this court's time long enough. And what about the permits?" The young lawyer suddenly spoke up, her voice regaining strength. She stood up straighter, emboldened by Musk's unexpected intervention. You still haven't explained why those permits were processed outside of normal channels. The lawyer glared at her, his mask slipping entirely now. I don't need to explain anything to you. My clients followed the rules. What rules? Musk said, his voice cutting through the lawyer's. He tilted his head slightly, as though genuinely curious. Rules you created? Rules you paid for? The lawyer turned to Musk, his frustration boiling over. You're out of line, and you're out of excuses, Musk shot back, his calm demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the fire underneath. The lawyer stumbled for a response, but Musk didn't give him the chance. You think you can bury the truth under a mountain of paperwork, but this community deserves answers. The gallery erupted into murmurs again, the energy shifting rapidly. The residents in the back row were nodding, whispering among themselves with renewed hope. Even the reporters seemed to sense it, a turning tide. Judge Hensley slammed his gavel once more, though it lacked its earlier force. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Musk didn't sit down. Instead, he stepped slightly closer to the front of the gallery, his gaze fixed on the judge. With all due respect, Your Honor, you're the one in control here. So let me ask you something. His voice softened, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. Why does it look like someone else is pulling the strings? The question hit the room like a bomb. The silence that followed was deafening. The young lawyer's jaw dropped slightly, while the real estate lawyer looked ready to explode. The man in the dark suit stiffened, his face unreadable, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Judge Hensley froze. His hand hovered above the gavel, trembling slightly. For the first time, he looked directly at Musk, truly looked at him. It was a moment of vulnerability, of something breaking free beneath the surface. The real estate lawyer slammed his hand on the table. This is a farce. Your Honor, you cannot allow... Sit down. Judge Hensley barked, his voice cracking. The lawyer fell silent, his face blanching. The judge exhaled slowly, his hand dropping back to his side. He looked utterly drained, as though Musk's words had stripped him bare. The man in the dark suit rose slowly, his movements deliberate. All eyes turned to him. He adjusted his tie, his expression dark and dangerous as he looked at Musk. You think you know what's going on here? Mr. Musk, he said quietly, his voice laced with venom. But you don't have a clue. Musk turned to face him fully, his gaze unflinching. Maybe not, he said evenly. But I'm about to. The two men stared each other down, the unspoken challenge thickening the air. The room felt on the brink of eruption, the battle lines drawn. Judge Hensley slumped slightly in his seat, his gaze shifting nervously between Musk and the man in the suit. It was clear now. Musk's presence had shaken something loose, and there was no turning back. The young lawyer sat down slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched her notes. She turned to Musk, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Musk didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the man in the dark suit, who hadn't moved. Finally, Musk turned back toward the front of the room, his expression calm but resolute. Now, he said quietly, we see what happens when the truth comes out. The real estate lawyer opened his mouth to protest again, but no words came. The man in the dark suit simply watched Musk, his expression unreadable but seething beneath the surface. The storm Musk had stirred wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning to crack wide open. The tension in the courtroom had reached a fever pitch. The silence that hung between Musk and the man in the dark suit was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. For the first time, the mask of quiet arrogance on the suited man's face began to crack. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides, and he leveled a stare at Musk that would have broken lesser men. But Musk didn't move, his calm confidence holding like iron. Judge Hensley cleared his throat, though the tremor in his voice was unmistakable. I must remind everyone here that this court will not tolerate disruptions. We are here to determine the facts of this case. Nothing more. Then let's get to the facts, Musk said, his voice slicing through the judge's indecision like a blade. Because so far, what I see is smoke and mirrors. The gallery began murmuring again, louder this time. The young lawyer turned to Musk, a flicker of hope in her tired eyes. The real estate lawyer, however, shot up from his seat in a fury. "Your Honor, I demand that this nonsense ends immediately," he roared. "Mr. Musk has no standing here. He's playing to the gallery. I'm playing to the truth," Musk interrupted, his voice calm but razor-sharp. His eyes locked on the real estate lawyer, and for a moment, it was as if the room belonged to Musk alone. "You're the one who seems desperate to avoid it. You're out of line," the lawyer shouted, his composure shattering in real time. "And you're out of excuses," Musk shot back, stepping forward now. His presence wasn't theatrical, but it carried weight, an unrelenting force pressing against the opposition's facade. He turned his gaze back to the judge. "Your Honor, this community deserves answers. You deserve answers, but you won't get them listening to him." Judge Hensley stared at Musk, the lines on his face deepening as though years of burden were pressing on him all at once. His hand, trembling faintly, hovered over his gavel again, but he didn't bring it down. The man in the dark suit shifted, his voice low and venomous as he spoke. "This is a waste of time," the man said, finally breaking his silence. His words were slow, deliberate, each one laced with menace. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Mr. Musk." Musk turned toward him, unblinking. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said, his voice like a quiet storm. "A man who's gotten away with too much for too long." The gallery gasped audibly. Even the reporters in the room stopped typing, their attention fixed on the two men like spectators in a duel. The man in the suit didn't flinch, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed the fury simmering beneath the surface. Judge Hensley's voice broke through the heavy silence, but it was weaker now, as though the fight in him was crumbling. "Mr. Musk, I urge you to stop this at once." "Why?" Musk asked simply, turning back to the judge. "Because it's making someone uncomfortable?" The judge didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the man in the dark suit, as though seeking silent permission. Musk saw it immediately, and his voice grew sharper. "You're scared of him," Musk said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "Everyone here can see it, but you don't have to be." Judge Hensley froze. The man in the dark suit stiffened, his gaze darkening. The real estate lawyer, clearly floundering now, tried to regain control. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. You cannot allow—" "Silence!" Judge Hensley barked, slamming his gavel down. But the sound lacked its former authority, as though he were struggling to convince himself that he was still in control. The weight of Musk's words seemed to hang in the air, seeping into every corner of the room. The young lawyer stood slowly, her voice trembling but steady. "Your Honor, if I may," she said softly, looking toward Musk with silent gratitude. She turned her gaze back to the judge. "All we've ever wanted is for this case to be judged fairly. The facts are here. You've seen the permits. You've seen the documents. You've seen everything you need to see. But if there's something or someone keeping you from doing what's right," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "Please, Your Honor, this community is counting on you." The judge's face crumpled slightly, his eyes darting between the young lawyer, the man in the dark suit, and Musk. The gallery was watching him now, every pair of eyes burning into him. Judge Hensley looked like a man drowning, his chest rising and falling as though struggling for air. Musk's voice broke the silence again, quieter now but no less commanding. "It's your courtroom," he said softly, "but it's their lives. Choose wisely." The man in the dark suit shifted again, his face like a thundercloud. He leaned toward the judge, his voice low and dripping with warning. "We had an agreement, Hensley. Remember that." The threat wasn't subtle. The gallery erupted again, murmurs turning into shocked gasps as the room fully grasped what was happening. Judge Hensley's hand trembled on his gavel, his expression crumbling under the weight of it all. Musk didn't look away. He stared at the judge, unrelenting. "You know what's right," he said softly. "You just have to have the courage to do it." The room fell silent again, all eyes fixed on Judge Hensley. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't move. The gavel hung in his hand, his breathing heavy, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like 1,000 tons. Finally, his hand dropped, but not to slam the gavel. Instead, he looked up, his voice barely audible as he whispered, "Mr. Musk, what is your involvement in this case?" The room collectively inhaled, shocked by the question. Musk tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at his lips. "I'm just here to help," he said calmly. And with that, the storm truly began to crack wide open. A heavy silence swallowed the room as the judge's question hung in the air. "What is your involvement in this case?" Judge Hensley had finally spoken the words that no one dared to ask. The man in the dark suit froze, his knuckles whitening as his hand gripped the edge of the table. The real estate lawyer sank back into his chair, his face ashen, while the gallery collectively leaned in, every breath held. Elon Musk stood motionless, his expression calm yet unrelenting, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Finally, he stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing through the chamber as he walked to the center of the room. He turned, facing both the judge and the man in the dark suit, before speaking with deliberate control. "I represent no one," Musk said quietly, his voice carrying with an unmistakable weight. "No special interests, no agenda. I'm here for one thing. The truth, the truth." The man in the dark suit's voice cracked like a whip, his calm demeanor splintering. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. "You don't belong here, Musk. This isn't your fight." Musk turned his head slightly, fixing his unflinching gaze on the suited man. "Maybe not," he replied, his tone still smooth but sharpened now. "But when I see corruption tearing apart communities, I don't just stand by." The gallery erupted. Murmurs of shock and disbelief rolled through the room like thunder. The young lawyer's eyes widened as though a dam had been broken, and for the first time, hope replaced the exhaustion in her expression. Judge Hensley, his face pale, gripped the bench like a man holding onto the last thread of his authority. "Mr. Musk," he croaked, his voice faltering. "What are you suggesting?" "What I'm suggesting," Musk said, his voice rising now with a quiet intensity, "is that this courtroom and this case has been manipulated from the very beginning. The facts have been buried. The system has been compromised. And all of it leads back to one man. He didn't need to say it." Every head in the room turned toward the man in the dark suit, who stared back with unmasked fury. His calm facade was gone. His eyes blazed with rage, and his voice rose like a blade cutting through the noise. "This is slander," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Musk. "Your Honor, I demand, no, I insist, that you put an end to this madness now. He has no right to accuse me or question this court. And you have no right to destroy lives," Musk countered sharply, his words ringing out like a gavel strike. He took another step toward the man, his presence towering. "You've been pulling strings and lining your pockets at the expense of this community, haven't you? Permits, deals, contracts. You've had your hands in all of it. Lies," the man in the suit shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of his panic. "I've done nothing wrong. This is outrageous." "Is it?" Musk's voice softened, but there was a new edge to it, like a storm gathering power. "Because I think if we dig deep enough, we'll find exactly what you're hiding." At that moment, the young lawyer, emboldened by Musk's stance, shot up from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "I'd like to submit new evidence to the court." All eyes turned to her, including Musk's. She held up a thick folder, her hand steady as she walked toward the bench. The real estate lawyer's face turned deathly pale. The man in the dark suit took a step back, his posture stiffening as though a noose were tightening around him. "What evidence?" the man barked, his voice cracking with desperation. "There's no evidence. This case is over." "Is it?" Musk said again, his tone deliberate as he echoed the man's own words. "Or are you just afraid of what comes next?" Judge Hensley hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his brow as he looked between the folder and the man in the dark suit. Finally, with trembling hands, He motioned for the young lawyer to bring the evidence forward. The man in the suit stepped forward, his voice breaking into a shout. "Your Honor, I strongly object to—" "Sit down," Judge Hensley barked, slamming the gavel so hard the sound echoed through the chamber. The man in the suit froze, his face twitching with rage, but he did not dare to move. The young lawyer placed the folder on the judge's bench and stepped back. The judge's fingers hovered above it, reluctant, as though the weight of the evidence itself might crush him. The room was silent again. You could hear a pin drop as Judge Hensley slowly opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page. His face fell. The man in the suit seemed to sense it instantly. "This is nonsense," he sputtered, his voice growing higher, more desperate. "You're all being misled. This is fake. He's lying." But no one was listening to him anymore. The gallery had erupted into frantic murmurs, the air alive with tension. Even the reporters were no longer typing. They were watching, wide-eyed, as the walls began to close in. Musk stepped closer to the man, his voice low enough that only he could hear. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" he said softly, his words calm but devastating. "You knew the truth would come out eventually." The man's expression crumbled, his fury replaced by something else. Fear. Real, tangible fear. Judge Hensley closed the folder, his hands shaking. He looked up, his gaze darting from Musk to the man in the suit, then back to the young lawyer. Finally, he spoke, his voice hollow but decisive. "This court will take a recess," he said, though everyone knew what it really meant. The battle was over. The man in the dark suit slumped back in his chair, his face pale and sweat-drenched. Musk stood tall, the quiet storm finally breaking around him. He turned back to face the gallery, the reporters, and the community members watching in awe. The weight of the truth had finally shattered the illusion. It was the beginning of the end. The man in the suit shot Musk a look of pure venom, but Musk didn't flinch. Instead, he met his gaze with a faint, knowing smile. "See you in the next round," Musk said quietly. The man's face twisted in rage, but he couldn't speak. He knew Musk had won this fight, and the fallout was just beginning. The courtroom door swung open with a heavy groan as Judge Hensley disappeared into his chambers, the folder clutched tightly in his trembling hands. The air in the room hung thick and electric, the silence punctuated by the scrape of chairs and the low hum of whispered speculation. All eyes turned to the man in the dark suit, who now sat frozen at the defense table, his once impenetrable facade crumbling like old plaster. Elon Musk stood tall and unwavering, his sharp gaze fixed on the man. The real estate lawyer, seated beside his client, was as pale as a ghost, wringing his hands and casting nervous glances at the gallery. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. There was nothing left to defend. From the corner of the gallery, a woman's voice rang out, clear and cutting. "That's him, isn't it? The man who pushed my family out of our home." The crowd erupted like a pressure valve bursting. Shouts and accusations filled the room, each word landing like a brick on the suited man's shoulders. Faces turned toward him, their anger no longer restrained. "You stole from us. You've ruined lives. We trusted you." The man in the suit finally shot to his feet, slamming his fists onto the table with a loud thud. "Silence," he bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain. "You people don't know what you're talking about. You're all being manipulated by this fraud." He jabbed a trembling finger in Musk's direction, his face red with fury. "You think you're a hero, don't you, Mr. Musk? Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong? This isn't your business." Musk tilted his head slightly, unbothered by the outburst. He let the man's words linger in the air for a beat, his calm demeanor only making the suited man look more unhinged. Then Musk spoke, his voice soft yet devastating. "My business," Musk said slowly, "is seeing justice done. I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable." The gallery erupted again, this time in a roar of approval. The young lawyer shot Musk a glance, her eyes wide with disbelief and admiration. She couldn't believe how quickly the tide had turned. how a room that had once been cloaked in intimidation and fear now pulsed with righteous anger. The man in the dark suit's composure cracked completely. "This is a circus," he shrieked, his voice grating against the noise. "Your Honor will see through all of this nonsense." "You sure about that?" Musk asked, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking as the man flinched. "Because from where I'm standing, you look awfully scared." "I'm not scared," the man spat, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You're nothing but a glorified showman. Musk, a billionaire playing savior for the cameras. And you're a man who got too comfortable believing he'd never be caught." Musk replied evenly. "You bullied this community, intimidated people, and cut corners because you thought you could get away with it forever. But guess what? Forever just ran out." The man's face twisted into something ugly, rage mixed with desperation. He turned toward the gallery, flailing for support. "You think he's on your side?" he shouted at the crowd. "He's just using you. All of you." "Funny," a voice called out from the back. "That's what you've been doing to us for years." Laughter rippled through the room, low and sharp like knives being unsheathed. The man in the suit spun back toward Musk, his chest heaving. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Musk didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, his voice quiet enough that only the man could hear him. "I think you're the one who doesn't know who he's messing with." The man's face blanched. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the door to Judge Hensley's chambers creaked open. The judge stepped out, his face pale but determined. The room fell into an immediate hush as all eyes turned toward him. "Order," Judge Hensley said softly, though the word carried the weight of 1,000 gavels. He returned to his bench, the thick folder now open in his hands. He didn't look at the man in the suit as he spoke. "This court has reviewed new evidence presented today," the judge began, his voice steady but clipped. "And what I have seen is deeply troubling." The man in the suit stiffened, his hands clutching the table like a lifeline. The gallery collectively held its breath. "Permits have been falsified," the judge continued. "Financial records manipulated. Properties obtained through coercion and intimidation." His voice dropped, each word cutting through the air like an axe. "You have abused the law and betrayed the trust placed in you by this community." "No," the man in the suit shouted, his voice raw and panicked. "You're wrong. This is all fabricated." "Enough," Judge Hensley thundered, his gavel slamming down with a force that seemed to shake the entire room. "Mr. Harris, you are hereby remanded to custody pending further investigation and formal charges." The room exploded. The suited man, Harris, stared at the judge in disbelief, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Two officers moved toward him, but Harris spun around, pointing wildly at Musk. "You did this," he screamed. "You set me up. You ruined me." "No," Musk replied quietly, watching as the man was cuffed and led away. "You ruined yourself." The officers dragged Harris through the gallery, the jeers and applause of the crowd echoing off the wooden walls. Some people were crying, others were clapping. The young lawyer, unable to hide her smile, turned to Musk. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. Musk gave her a small nod. "Sometimes you don't get a choice." She looked at him for a long moment, as though trying to understand the man behind the calm exterior. Then she turned away, stepping into the crowd of people embracing each other, their relief palpable. Musk stood quietly, watching the community reclaim the space that had been stolen from them. For the first time in hours, the room felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. He turned toward the door, but before he could leave, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Musk." Musk turned back, raising an eyebrow. Judge Hensley met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," the judge said quietly. Musk gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before walking out of the courtroom. Outside, the sun was shining. As Elon Musk stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of the courtroom battle still lingered in the air behind him. Inside, justice had been served, a corrupt system exposed, and a community vindicated. But the story wasn't just about one courtroom or one man's downfall. It was about something far bigger, the power of standing up for what's right no matter the odds. This isn't just a story about Elon Musk using his influence to take on corruption. It's a story about courage, about how one person's voice can spark a chain reaction that changes everything. Elon didn't come into that courtroom looking for recognition or applause. He came because he saw something wrong and refused to ignore it. He showed us all that sometimes being a bystander isn't an option. Sometimes you have to step in, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's messy. And what about Judge Hensley? He was a man caught between doing the right thing and caving to pressure. But when the moment came, he chose courage over fear. It's a reminder that even when we're overwhelmed, even when the world feels stacked against us, we still have the power to make the right choice. And then there's the community, the people who finally found their voices after years of being silenced. Their victory wasn't just Musk's doing. It was their perseverance, their fight, their refusal to give up. So what's the lesson here? It's simple. Corruption thrives in silence, but justice begins when someone, anyone, decides to speak up. And if a billionaire like Elon Musk can roll up his sleeves and fight for what's right, then so can you. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to make a difference. Why not let that person be you?